VC and Beetle people, it's been a rough couple of days here. I did something that I've never done before. I listened to back to back in their entirety. I've owned these albums for 40 some years. I think I've had them since 76, 77. Over the years, occasionally just for a laugh or just out of odd curiosity, I've put them on the turntable to give them a little bit of a listen, but I've never been able to get all the way through any one of them. But yesterday, through uh, act of sheer willpower, somehow, for the benefit of you, I listened to them front to back all the way through, and boy, it was sure fun. Let me tell you. So we've got two versions: "Life with the Lines" and the wedding album. The inauspicious beginning to John Lennon's solo career. Having done the other three Beatles solo records, I certainly wanted to do John's. I did the other three in order of release, which I also plan to do with John, but I just thought that I would make an exception on this first installment because it just sort of makes sense, seems to make sense to group these three masterpieces together and get them out of the way and done with. Kind of like you got to get a tooth pulled at the dentist or something. It's probably best just to yank it out and have done with it. So, this one's first. This came out November 11th, 1968. Some way, somehow, it reached number 124 on the charts in the United States. Did not chart in England. The album, of course, and I think if it's okay with you, I think we'll just leave the brown wrapper on it. I really no mood to look at John and Yoko's junk. If Patty Boyd would have made an album cover like this, that'd be a different thing, but we'll just leave that be. So the album, of course, is notorious and best known for the fact that John and Yoko are in the buff on the front and back covers. They thought that was a good idea for some reason. Nobody else in the world did, but they had fun doing it, I guess, so more power to them. What's less spoken about is the contents of the album, probably because very few people ever got through more than a couple of minutes of it. But I've heard this described as Revolution Number 9 stretched out to album length, which kind of works in a way. There's some talking, there's some tape loops, there's John sort of banging away with discordant piano notes, a little bit of guitar maybe, mainly piano. Yoko, thank God, doesn't do her banshee screeching here. She basically just sort of moans and groans and makes strange sounds and sort of stutters and I don't know, makes weird sounds. And there's a little bit of them talking to each other, and there is a couple of bits where there's a Guy Lombardo song playing in the background on side one, and on side two there's another old song by I forget who that you can hear a few seconds of. I don't think it's exactly the comparison of this to Revolution 9 is doesn't really hold up, because Revolution 9, which love, hate, or indifferent to it, personally I rather like it. It's not a song I go out of my way to listen to, but for what it is, I've always kind of enjoyed it, and it has the whole mythology built up around it and so forth. But Revolution Number 9, whether you like it or not, has some kind of cohesiveness or narrative, and it definitely has peaks and valleys and variation throughout the piece of music or soundscape or whatever you want to call that. This is pretty much, it doesn't really vary much throughout the whole of the two sides. It's sort of just a drone of a thing. It maybe could have some use for people that get CDs of whale songs or winds rustling through the prairie or water sounds of waterfalls to help them relax or go to sleep. I don't know how relaxing this is, but it may well put you to sleep. So it might have some purpose there, but the where Revolution Number Nine seems to have some semblance of artistry to it, even if I would think even people that don't like it might even agree with that. Maybe not, but this just seems like just random sounds. And I think one reviewer said something like that this is if you turned a tape recorder on and left your house for 30 minutes and came back and played whatever it recorded, sort of feel to it. So not very good. The side two has one part in the middle that I found a little bit interesting. It has 20-30 seconds of sort of a sped up Old West barroom piano bit in there, which I guess is John playing piano, and they just sped up a lot of this. The tape of these recordings is very speeded and sped up and slowed down. And so anyway, the old barroom piano bit, I'm not saying it's interesting enough to warrant a listen of this album at all, but that's about the only thing I was kind of stretching to find anything really interesting about the content or music of this album, and that's about all I could find. It reminded me of, and I just went blank on the title, but on much better album than this, Wonderwall, George Harrison's Wonderwall album, one of the songs ends with the music sped up, and it's got a piano, kind of a, I think a tack piano or an old, sort of sounds like an old saloon, Old West piano that's starts off and then it speeds up and gets faster and faster. And this is not that same piece of music, it's a different deal, but it's similar in nature. And boy, isn't that interesting. So that's about all I could find of interest on the so-called music on either side of this album. It's one side is 14 minutes and 14 seconds, side two is 15 minutes and 13 seconds. The label just says John and Yoko, two virgins. It doesn't have track listings, but apparently these do have tracks, even though the whole album just sort of blends together. But they're just track number one, number two, and so side one is tracks numbers 1 through 5, and side two is tracks numbers 6 through 10. This is a copy that I got, like I said, somewhere around 76 or 77. I don't think this is original. I'm pretty sure it's a counterfeit, but that's okay. So that's Two Virgins. Very exciting stuff. And so we move on to the second release, Life with the Lions, Unfinished Music number 2, Life with the Lions. This came out May 9th of 1969. Didn't do as well as Two Virgins chart-wise. It only got to number 174 on the charts, did not chart in England. The title is a play on Life with the Lions, Lyons, which is was an old BBC radio comedy that was around back in that time. I've never heard it, so I'm not really sure what the story is on that show, other than it's just a radio show that I guess John liked. And this one, always did like that cover though. This just the composition of the photograph, which is a little out of focus, but still kind of an interesting picture. And then on the back, I think this picture came from a newscast or a newspaper photograph, but also kind of a grainy picture, but composition is sort of interesting. And again, the cover is more interesting than the music and sounds inside on the album. This was on the Zapple label, Zapple, instead of the Apple label, which was a little subsidiary label of Zapple, very short-lived. There's the Zapple logo there. Only 2 albums ever released on that label. This one, Electronic Sounds by George. There was a third album, it was supposed to be a spoken word album. I can't remember who, Richard Brodigan or somebody like that. It was scheduled to come out on Zapple, and those plans were scrapped. And I think that album came out on another label, if it ever came out at all. But anyway, only two releases on Zapple. Neither one of them any good. George's Electronic Sounds would be his worst album, and this would be one of John's worst too, of course. So, anyway, Life with the Lions is no good, but at least a little more varied than the music sounds of Two Virgins. Side one is Cambridge 1969, which was a live concert or a live appearance that John and Yoko did at Cambridge University in 1969, thus the title. Uh, this unfortunately does have the screeching sea hag banshee histrionics that Yoko is so famous for. Sounds like somebody's birthing bowling balls or having an epileptic fit or doing both at the same time. And John's, while she's howling and screaming and carrying it on and acting a fool, John's just basically banging on the guitar with a bunch of feedback, and maybe he's trying to drown out listening to her. I don't know, but anyway, neither one of them is much fun to listen to. Occasionally, a little bit of interesting guitar bit here and there from John over the. I think this thing lasts like 25 minutes, so it's a painful endurance test to get through this. Somehow I did. Terrible, terrible stuff. And the shame of it is that John did so few concert appearances after the Beatles, and most of them were pretty crap, including this one. I can just imagine. I don't know if this is a show that they sold tickets to the general public, or if this is something that they just told the students at Cambridge one day, hey, John and Yoko are going to be here to play a concert. There were other people, there were some jazz people or something that played that concert too, I think, but I just can imagine whoever the kids that showed up to this concert being excited that they were going to get to see a Beatle, and then this is what they get. Just a bunch of erratic guitar feedback and a crazy screaming woman on the stage. So not very good, and an endurance to get through. Side two is well, this was before they were married, and she Yoko had a miscarriage, which is certainly a sad, terrible thing, and that's sort of a side two is sort of a documentary, strange thing to document, but a documentary of that event in their lives. So side two, the first song, I guess, is No Bed for Beatle John, which he stayed in the hospital with her, which was, decent and nice and proper thing for him to do. But they couldn't get a bed for him, so he just got a cot or a sleeping bag or something and slept on the floor in her hospital room. No Bed for Beatle John is a song sung by Yoko. Uh, Honestly, the song's got an okay melody. It's the problem is she's just not a good singer. Even she tries to sing. Occasionally she can be okay. Happy Christmas War is over, and Sisters Oh Sisters, okay, but never great, and usually just really bad. Nice enough melody to the song. The lyrics are pretty crap and awkward, but it's got in the background would be John, I guess, sort of singing background, a little bit of a Gregorian chant going on. Slightly interesting melody, okay song, but in the end, it doesn't really add up to too much. Song number two, I guess I'm going to keep calling them songs. I don't know what else to call them. Is Baby's Heartbeat, which is several minutes. I had the time and I didn't write it down, but 4 or 5 minutes of a heartbeat, which actually sounds more like sounds of a video game to me. But apparently, this is the heartbeat of their actual child before he died, which is sort of a macabre thing to be putting on an album, but it's their life, their business, I guess. So you get the heartbeat for 3 or 4 minutes, and then all of a sudden it just stops, and the next track, that's what I'll call them, tracks instead of songs, the next track is called 2 Minutes of Silence, on account of its 2 minutes of silence, and as such it's probably the best thing on the album. So the 2 minutes of silence go by, and then we get about 12 minutes of the next and thankfully last track, which is called Radio Play, which is about 12 minutes of somebody fiddling with a radio dial, just going back and forth, and so you get all this static and sounds cutting in and out. And in the background you can hear John making a phone call, which would be very annoying to be trying to talk on the phone while somebody's doing that with the radio for 12 minutes. But there it is, and with that, the epic masterpiece, Life with the Lions, concludes, and we move on to the next, the third, and thankfully the final album of this nonsense, which is the Wedding Album. Came out October 20th of 1969, got to number 178 in the United States. This one, and that's the front of the box. I had this one. Never had a U.S. or a British original copy of the Wedding Album. This is and this is an original. I think, like I'm saying, my two versions I think is a counterfeit copy. This is a real copy of this, and I got this 77 or so, 77, 78. Back around the same time, I got a Japanese Wedding Album with the Obi strip and all, which I sold somewhere years later. When this was re-released last year on I can't read that, but anyway, this was re-released last year, and I went ahead just to fill in my collection and bought it because it was only about $35, so I figured why not. So thrilled to have it back in my collection. It's a little box set of an album. Here's the actual album, and there's the back, and it's got a gatefold. This one is the re-release from last year. It's on white vinyl. I'm not going to take it out, but you just have to take my word for it. And inside you get all this. I'm not going to take, there's a picture of their wedding cake, a postcard with them at the bed end. There's booklets of cartoons and press clippings and posters and all that stuff. So kudos for being a well put together set with all the goodies and extras in the box set. And the cover is okay, kind of a takeoff on the White Album, like in a little sort of a way, or White Wedding, whatever. I don't know. So it's a lavish, elaborate set, which kind of surprises me that Capitol would have sprung, because that had to cost more to produce that than if they just put out the Wedding Album as just an album like that. And given that Life with the Lions and Two Virgins didn't sell diddly, and they probably knew this wasn't going to either, that had to cost a lot to produce all those box sets, and so kind of a surprise that the record company would go for that. But they did, and there it is. Wedding Album has 2 songs on it. Side 1 is titled John and Yoko, which is 22 minutes and 44 seconds of John and Yoko saying John and Yoko, repeating each other's names over and over, softly, at voice level, yelling, screaming, shouting it, saying it different ways, and every which way but Sunday. So if you ever wanted to listen to 2 people say each other's names for 22 minutes, your dream has just come true, and there it is for you. Very hard to sit through that, very boring. But I will say, when I was a kid, when I got this album, I was 13 or whatever I was, there was a sort of I can't believe this, or funniness in that sense that this is ridiculous. So it's sort of funny. And I do remember sort of playing this for a couple of friends of mine, like, you should check this out. Not, we didn't sit there for 22 minutes listening to this nonsense, but just a few minutes. And back in the good old days before cell phones with caller ID and all that, when, you know, red-blooded American kid, you could have fun and make crank phone calls. I do remember us calling people occasionally and just playing, putting the phone up to the speaker, playing this just to see how long people would, before they'd hang up. Uh, you know, and sometimes in the summertime, after you've been swimming every day, you got tired of that and you had to think of something else to do, I guess. But so we got a little bit of fun out of John and Yoko, at least, if nothing else. Side two is called Amsterdam, which is just sort of an, I guess, audio documentary of their bed in for peace. And a little bit of Yoko singing, a little bit of them being interviewed, a little bit of them just randomly talking to each other, and it's 25 minutes of just sort of, and even though I listened to the whole thing yesterday, about, I don't know, 5 or so minutes into it, I did let it play through, but my mind wandered and I picked up a magazine or something and sort of zoned in and out, sort of checked back in, and nope, it's about the same as it was 5 minutes ago. And very mundane, pointless thing. So that is the Wedding album. Anyway, if I were to give these things a 1 to 10 rating, really they should get a 0, all three of them. But I'm going to go ahead and give them a 2, just for the sheer, there's something I can't say that I'm glad that I finally listened to them all the way through, but in the 40 some years I've had them, every 5-10 years or so, I will take one of them out and put it on for a few minutes, just for a grin. So they've given me some, in an absurd, strange way, some sort of enjoyment through the years. You do wonder, was John just so whacked out on drugs he didn't know what he was doing? Did he purposely do this just to pull the wool over everybody's eyes, the way that people were looking to Beatles and Bob Dylan lyrics for the meaning of life and so forth back in 67, 68? Was this just his way of saying, I'll put this out, let the people try to find some meaning in this? Was he just goofing off and having fun? I wonder if John or Yoko ever listened to these damn things again after they made them. And you do have to admire the sheer gall of, here's the main guy in the biggest musical act, arguably the biggest musical act in the history of ever, who is putting out these things. And it is, I do kind of get a laugh out of people, I guess, by Life with the Lions and the Wedding album. People probably figured out what was going on, but with Two Virgins or whatever, you wonder if some people ran out and bought these things because, hey, it's Beatle John, and they went home expecting Beatle, pop rock music, and we're sitting there going, what in the hell? I mean, they would have already been saying what in the hell when they saw the naked pictures and all, but I mean, so I do enjoy, just like I said, just the sheer lunacy and balls and chutzpah and gall to put these ridiculous things out. So I will give them a little credit for that, and that's why I'm giving these albums a 2 instead of a 0. And I have somewhat good memories of them. I remember being, I knew of the Beatles when I was a kid, when they were still together, but didn't really tune into them, like I've said a million times, till about 73, when I was about 9 years old. And so when you get into the Beatles back in those days, it wasn't like if younger kids get into the Beatles today, you can just go you know, and you don't know that much about them. You just Google them, and you go on the internet, and there's all sorts of websites and podcasts and Wikipedia. And if you need more, you go to Amazon, and there's, you know, thousands of Beatle books at your fingertips if you got the money to buy them. Well, in 1973, we didn't have all that, so you sort of learned about the Beatles or any other group you were interested in, Rolling Stones or the Doors or whoever. You know, there weren't a ton of books about them in the bookstore. There was no internet, so you had to ask people that, you know, like your older brothers and sisters or whatever, what they could tell you about the Beatles, and just sort of figure it out on your own. And that was, I think, it was better that way because it was more fun. It was kind of almost like a treasure hunt to find out about, you know, oh, the Beatles have a Christmas album. I've never seen that in the store. Why don't I ever see it in the store? And then you find out it's only the fan club thing, and oh, I didn't know they had a fan club. And well, what's on this Christmas album? And you know, stuff like that. And it was the same with these albums because I remember reading about them in the growing up with the Beatles book and the Beatles Illustrated discography, the Podrazak and the other guy that wrote that book. And I remember reading about them in Beatles Forever, the Nicholas Schaffner book. But then I was like, well, wait a minute. I don't remember ever seeing these in the store. I go to the record stores and I see the Imagine and Mind Games and those John albums, but I've never seen these in the store. And I can remember being a kid of 11 or 12 and getting out the phone book and calling record stores in Fort Worth and asking, you know, hey, do you have Two Virgins, or do you have Life with the Lions or the Wedding album? And I guess some of those places they didn't know. They said, well, let me check, and they checked. Said, no, we don't have that in stock. And finally, I called the record store. It's called Sybil's Golden Oldies, run by an old lady named Sybil, long gone now. But she told me, you know, no, those aren't available anymore. They're cutouts. And I was like, well, okay, what's a cutout? And she explained what a cutout. So I learned something else, you know, back. Like I said, it's more fun, I think, then than it is now, because now if someone says cut out, you don't know what it is, you just look it up on the internet and there it is, and what's the fun in that? So tracking these down was a lot of fun, and finally finding copies of them and getting them, and I was, you know, excited to hear them because I heard that they were just sound effects or them saying their name over and over, but I wanted to actually hear them for myself, or I thought I did. I didn't, like I said, I couldn't last all the way through any of them, but it was fun. It was an adventure, and you know, I mean, I can't imagine really anyone else other than John doing something like this. You can't really imagine Paul doing, even though he's done experimental albums. You certainly couldn't imagine Mick Jagger or Keith Richards or someone like that doing something like this. So good on him. It's goofy. It doesn't mean the albums aren't lousy. They are, but just the fact that they exist sort of is in a strange, perverted sort of way, kind of cool, I guess. But still, just a two, and things get better from here on out. One last thing about this is that John, up to this point, had the Beatles were groundbreaking, of course, and he had experimented, him and the other Beatles, but he had experimented to the good. Rain, his stuff on Revolver, Sergeant Pepper, I'm the Walrus, Strawberry Fields, all that stuff. Here he experiments to the less good, I guess, but still very experimental and strange stuff, even though there are precedents of Cage and so forth, like Stockhausen and Cage and stuff. But here he's experimenting. But you know, once he got these things out of his, and as fun in a goofy way as they are, I'm glad that after this Wedding album, he sort of called it a day on this stuff and didn't keep on going down this path, because we really don't need any more of this stuff. But once he got these out of his system, I realized in listening to these yesterday that he kind of really stopped with the experimenting stuff, and his solo albums, while a lot of them have great songs and all, are by and large, almost completely just basic rock and roll and pop songs, which is not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing, but he was no longer wildly experimental after this. It sort of occurred to me, like I said, listening to these yesterday, I've gone on way too much about 3 albums that most people have never listened to all the way through, and probably can't recommend that they do. But anyway, we'll be back with more John stuff, and hope everybody's having a good couple of days before Christmas Eve here, and a nice Sunday. Take care.